tell you how we became interested in researching Duke's life and his music. And stop me if I go more than 10 minutes. I've got my timer going here anyway. If you fall asleep when I'm talking, don't snore too loudly. I first became seriously interested in Ellington about 25 or 30 years ago. I was driving home from work and was listening to the CBC radio, and they played Daybreak Express from a newly released compact disc. It blew my mind. I just loved the reed section work in there. So I rushed to a store and I bought that CD. And while I was there, I also bought a CD of the 1957 Carrollton, Pennsylvania dance, which had the definitive version of Diminuendo and Crescendo in blue on it. Gonzalo's solo on that one is my favorite version of his solo. So anyway, I now have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Ellington CDs. I have no idea what's going to happen to them when I die because who uses CDs anymore? For about 18 years, I had my own band, 15 to 17 pieces, depending on how many people were awake that particular week. We played nothing but Ellington and Strayhorn music. Thank heavens, by the time I got into this, David Berger was releasing Jazz at Lincoln Center transcriptions. And so I was able to put together a library of maybe 100 or 120 pieces. So that was a lot of fun. And then the pandemic hit. So I haven't got the band going again. And I don't have the energy to do it anymore. So sometime during the 1990s, I discovered the Duke Ellington discussion list. That's an email group for those who aren't familiar with it. And there were so many people on there who were very knowledgeable about Ellington. It was just a wonderful thing to be part of. And that's where I learned about the Ellington 2000 conference, which I had no idea that Stephen organized it. That was my first conference. I drove down the coast. It took about 4 days to get there. I listened to Ellington on cassettes all the way. It was a beautiful conference, but there was so much Ellington music. On the way back, I couldn't listen to any of it. I had to listen to classical music. The next conference I went to was in Stockholm in 2004. Then I went off to London in 2008, and then in Woking, which is near London, in 2012. Amsterdam in 2014, where I did my first presentation. Portland in 2015, where I did a very rushed presentation because we didn't have much time. And then New York in 2016, I didn't do any presentation there. I went to the conference in Washington in 2000. Flew all night, got there, had a wonderful presentation all ready to go. It was to do with when Walla Walla went wild, Walla Walla being a town in Washington State. And the only problem is we got into Washington and that day they canceled the conference. So I feel it sort of panicked a little bit. I naturally bought every book that I could find about Ellington, the Tucker books, and 20, 25 biographies, whatever. The one that really captured my imagination was Stradiman's Duke Ellington Day by Day and Film by Film. Is that backwards, maybe? He had chapters on every film that Ellington made, and in between them, he laid out the day-by-day routines that he had discovered with a lot of help from Stephen, whoever he was. And it just captured my imagination because as a kid, I'd been on one band trip. We took a train across Canada, and I had an idea what it was like, but I didn't have any idea what it was like to be in a band that traveled from place to place, night after night after night. They finish at one place, they get back on the bus or the train, depending on the year it was, and they go another 500 miles, 800 kilometers for the next gig. And they get in there, they have to find a place to stay, and they carry on, and they keep just, it's just night after night after night of a grind. But it captured my imagination. In 2005, Andrew Homsey of the Duke Ellington specialist and a professor at Concordia University asked if anybody was willing to put together a website about Duke Ellington and just trying to bring together a list of all the various internet links to Ellington. I foolishly took that on, and it was a silly project to do because there's just so much out there and it's constantly changing. But doing that, I learned how to write HTML. Let's see if I get to this now. I don't know how to move it ahead, but that's Stradamus book. That was my first website, and it's way up. I haven't even looked at it for 10 or 12 years. So, well, that gave me a good start, and it was a lot of fun to do it anyway. And my next one was I discovered how pretty the labels were on the Ellington78s, and they were beautiful. And I took a few pictures of a few that I could get a hold of, and I decided to put together a web page on that. So I started doing that, and I covered a fair amount of them. Some pictures are good quality, some are not. Carl Hellström in Sweden somehow discovered this as well, and we started collaborating. And Carl's was a bit of a taskmaster. He started sending me more images, some from his own collections, I guess. Some that he's created from various websites and so on, so they varied in quality. But we just carried on. Putting these together. And suddenly around 2011, Klaus Butting here in Paris offered his own compilation of Ellington's itinerary called The Duke, Where, and When. I'm not proud, I stole the name. He didn't want it to be put online because he has stuff on there which I guess he thought should not be there because it was perhaps copyrighted or whatever. But for those of you who knew Carl was very much a hard taskmaster, and he would push and push and push until you agreed to do something. Well, first of all, he persuaded Klaus to let this material go online, and then he nagged the heck out of me until I agreed to put it together in a website. He wanted it as PDFs, and I wanted a website. So I started doing that, and that was about 2011 or 2012. And that's just where it went. It's my third attempt at a web page, and it seems to have been fairly successful. So it got to be too big for most people to be able to download it. So a few months back, I divided it into 2 pages. So the first page is TDWA W1 HTML, and it covers up to 1945. And then the second page goes from 1946 to the end of Ellington's life. Actually, it goes to Carney's death in September of that year. What you have is, on the left-hand side, the date the event started. The next column is the event went more than 1 day, when it ended. Then we have the city it took place in, the name of the venue, banquet hall or whatever it would be, and then the details of the event that I would be able to scrape out from whatever the research was. And then the next column is the reference materials that we used. And then there's the new DSR references where it's recordings, and the next column over that is the DEMS references, which are very good, but they're hard to get through at times. The third column, or the last column, I'm not sure why I have an other column because I never use it. There's stuff in there that came from Klaus's material when I converted it to HTML. And the final column in very fine print, you can see when the entry was made and when the last update was. So if you've been on there and you've looked at a particular date, you can look back at the date and see whether anything's changed since you were there last time. Some of those changes are fairly superficial. They might be just a change in spelling or whatever. It's more so that I can keep track of what it is. It's been a lot of fun to do this. I was putting in 8 or 10 or even 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for several years. I estimate I've put about 30,000 hours into it. It wouldn't be possible to have done this without Stephen. I imagine Stephen has probably spent 15,000 hours correcting my mistakes and giving me new information. There's a constant flow. He commented 7 or 8 emails a day. Well, yes, and I don't think we've had more than that usually. Not before we started fighting, but what the heck. And of course, there's an awful lot of research here that was done by our predecessors. And on top of that, K.Steiner. I stole a lot of his information for the stuff that he distributed through the Dennis bulletins, and also at the Wild Throng Dances at the Cellar Club. He gave that out at the 2004 conference or 2008 conference. So it's a compilation. It's something that will never be finished. And I don't know what's going to happen to it when I run out of time on this earth. But I hope somebody will then pick up the torch and carry on from there. And hopefully they won't have to change their way of thinking too badly to try to adapt my way of doing it.
Give them your password.
I won't do that. This was Klaus's original document. It went on 103 or 120 pages. I mentioned Carl Hellstrom and Klaus Luting, Stephen K.Steiner, Patricia Willard, who would have liked to be here. I heard from her only a week ago. She's a bit too old to travel right now. And very recently we've been joined by Steve Bowie, who I think is in California. But he has access to many resources that I can't touch. Bowie. I've never met the man. I hope to one day. What's very frustrating is one of the biggest newspaper archives is ProQuest, and they do not allow an individual to subscribe. You have to be a student at a university, or you actually have to be a university to subscribe, and your students can then participate, or you have to be a library, and the libraries in my area won't spend the money to subscribe. Steve Bowie has access to that. There's a ton of resources out there that we've discovered. Colleges and so on are very good because you can look at their yearbooks and in the college newspapers. And I think I am 4 minutes over time, so I'm stopping now. Thank you, everybody.
Salvador Dali began his autobiography with these words: "At the age of 6, I wanted to be a cook. At the age of 7, I wanted to be Napoleon, and my ambition has grown steadily ever since. At the age of 6, my favorite orchestra was led by Lawrence Welk, and he was on television every weekend. So that's all I knew. I didn't know Duke Ellington. Then when I was 9 or 10, the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and for the next 2 years, I was lost in rock and roll and long hair. Junior year of high school, a fellow guitarist introduced me to Django Reinhardt, and my life has been different ever since. And he was the first jazz person I really collected on records, in 78s. And then in college, some friends of mine had a band, and they played all the great classic stuff. The clarinet player, who played a lot like Barney Bigard, introduced me to Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday and Art Tatum and everybody we like, Fats Waller, and introduced me to 78 collecting in a big way, and I've been collecting ever since. And my Duke Ellington 78 collection is essentially complete for original issues and prime pressings, German Brunswicks, Australian HMVs, and so on. And I have a photo collection that is of early Ellington photos. It's pretty thorough. You'll be seeing some of them in Nick Rossi's presentation tomorrow. And but for researching Ellington, it started with the collecting and with going to conferences. My first conference was in 1985 in Oldham, England, and I see Lee and Millie Farley are here. They were there, and I believe they're the only ones here who were also there. Were you there, perhaps? No. Yes, you were there. Who was there? Oh, George Dubrow, of course. And there were so many wonderful people to meet there. Jimmy Hamilton, Alice Babs, Herb Jeffries, Charles Delaunay, let's see some other names, Bob Wilbur, John Chilton, Jerry Valburn, and we could go on. It was a spectacular conference, and still my favorite of all of them, even over the two that I was program chairman of in 91 and 2000 in Los Angeles. And I've been researching Duke Ellington forever, seriously, since 1986, which is when I first, I went to a conference in New York. Much of it was held at Rutgers, and I found all the Jeanette recording cards and decided when I get back to LA, I want to go liberate the files at Universal, at MCA Records, Decca Records, which had all the Brunswick and Vocalion files from before 1932. So I found a lot of new discoveries there, and I spent a month in New York in October of '87 at RCA Victor, our BMG, and at Columbia, which was bought out that month by Sony. I was there at Sony every afternoon and at BMG every morning. And you see, my goal was to distrust everything and look only at original primary sources, because that's the way you correct everything that could possibly go wrong. And so I shared that information that I exhumed through friends, Jerry Valburn, through the Dems Bulletin especially, to which I was a contributor, all the way through 2012 when Jeff Hushmet left us. And Dems is currently online, and you can look through all the old bulletins, and there's a wealth of information. And lately, my research has been funneled through the website that David Palmquist will tell you so much about, the Duke, Where and When. And I was surprised to hear from Jean-Francois Rigaud that he didn't know about it, and that he'd asked some French friends, and they didn't know about it. Well, this is the best site, better than any book, if you want to learn about what Duke Ellington did when. And it is probably the most detailed website dedicated to any one musician and maybe any one cultural figure that we have. It's vast. It's organized chronologically in the main, and tells you more than you want to know. But we find it interesting, and I send David an email most every day with something new.
More than one.
Sometimes 7 or 8. That's true. And he's gotten around to a lot of it. Well, he'll tell you about that later. So anyway, I brought a cheat sheet here. So that's our individual introductions, my introduction to the life and music of Duke Ellington. Let's see, in general terms, I've shared it through my research through a lot of books. Mark Tucker was a friend of mine. I proofread his Duke Ellington Reader. Klaus Stratemann, maybe some of you know Day by Day and Film by Film. I contributed a lot of research to that. I've helped people all the time. Let's see, most lately I proofread somebody's chapter on Ellington 2 weeks ago. So, anybody want to send me stuff, I'll generally read through it and get out my red pen. And one of the nicest compliments I ever had came from Luciano Massagli of the New Dessort team. That's Duke Ellington's story on record, the big discography. And he said, "Stephen, it's your red pen we fear the most." So I didn't bring it with me. Now, I also want to get into what we're finding all the time. So I picked out a few things that have contributed to the Duke Where and When in 2022, last year. I'd had no idea about in 2021, and they were all new discoveries. Well, for one thing, I contributed a web page to Max Shaw. It's called a supporting web page. It's on a variety of topics. There are different web pages appended to the Duke Where and When. Max Shaw was the tuba player in 1926 and 27, who contributed so much to the sound of East St. Louis Toadlow, Birmingham Breakdown, and the earliest Ellington records that display the Ellington effect, and it is identifiably Ellington. Let's see. I wrote about the Orchard Beach photo of August 12th of 1926. I wrote about Asleep in the Feet. Now, anybody know what that is? That's a short film from 1933. Thelma Todd and Zazu Pitts. Now, why should that be of interest to anyone? Because it uses Duke Ellington's Victor recording of Jubilee Stomp for about 10 minutes of the 20-minute two-reel feature. And no credit to Duke Ellington. But that was a first. That was the first time a commercial recording was used in a feature, and that's a significant source of income for the Ellington estate today. I found in Motion Picture Exhibitors Herald, something like that, Motion Picture Herald, an article from September of 1934 about the very first jazz exhibition. It was a motion picture exhibitor named Rosie rented a storefront, and he put in an exhibit of photographs of the Ellington band, and giving away signed autograph photographs too. And I will gather that they took two copies of the 1933 press manual and pasted them up all over the room. But that was a new thing in exploitation. As I say, probably the first exhibition of jazz anywhere in the world. It's another Ellington first. 1935, February, Ellington band goes to Kansas City, and some of the guys want to go see the Moten band with Basie. And Willem Brooks said, well, why do you want to see them? Well, they saw them and they saw Walter Page. And Ellington wanted to hire Walter Page for his own band. But Basie said, oh no, you can't. He owes me $300. Until that's paid off, you can't take him. And Page said, that's probably the smartest move Basie ever made in all those good years of the Ellington band. It wasn't there. So that came as a surprise. March 17th of 1937, new Cotton Club review opens with Duke Ellington. And did you know, I only found out this year, there was a 1 hour minstrel show with Duke Ellington as the interlocutor. Now, why is that interesting? Because traditionally in minstrel shows, the interlocutor wears whiteface. We don't have any pictures of that if he did. But you got to scratch your head on that. 1940, in April and May, Ellington was here, and they played downtown at the Paramount Theater and recorded Cottontail and Never Know Lament. One night from a late night hour until 9 in the morning, Jimmy Blanton went to where Arcadium was, and they jammed all night long. It was a mutual admiration society. Wouldn't we have loved to be a fly on the wall for that? Yeah. 1942, July. Duke Ellington wants to replace Bogarty. He wants to hire Ed Hall away from Teddy Wilson's band in New York Cafe Society. But Ed Hall didn't want to travel. But Teddy Wilson returned the favor by trying to hire Hodges away from Ellington. That didn't work, thank goodness. 1945, in May, Duke Ellington recorded 10 of his greatest songs at 5 different sessions for RCA Victor, and his contract called for 2 albums a year, and they'd already done the one Black and Brown and Beige album, and the second one was this new 10-sided album of Ellington songs and fresh arrangements from Strayhorn and himself. And it was a great project. And the arrangements were great. Oh, the version of Caravan was wonderful. But a couple months after they recorded it, a new A&R director came to RCA Victor named Eli Oberstein. And Ellington and Oberstein clashed. And Oberstein retaliated by suppressing this album. Nothing would come out until after he left during the recording ban of 48. 2 sides came out in 49, and eight sides came out on an LP in '51. But that had to be very disappointing to, to Ellington. And then what do I still hope to research? One thing I really have got to get to and haven't done, and lazy Stephen. Jimmy McHugh's grandson lives in Los Angeles, and he has 8 or 10 scrapbooks of Jimmy McHugh's, which document the Cotton Club years. And there've got to be programs we've never seen and maybe photos. So I've got to give him a call one of these days. But I've done most of the research in the recording files. I've never seen Atlantic. I've seen Reprise. They're on different coasts. I was able to get the Capitol files out of Local 47 in Los Angeles, and all the contracts from all the companies. And some of the other archives I've been to are RKO for movie files, Paramount. When my brother was making a movie for Columbia, I was able to get the information on Reveille with Beverly and when that was done. And libraries, USC, UCLA, LA Public Library, Mount St. Mary's College in California, the Academy Library, the Library of Congress, the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian, which is the only archive that all 4 of the panelists you'll see today have mined. Most especially Michael, who you'll hear from. And he comes last. The order that we do this is when we came into serious Ellington research. For me, it was 1986. For David and Ken, it was in the early 2000s. And Michael, when did you come into it?
Oh my gosh, pretty late.
Oh yeah? Oh, well, then you should follow me, but I'm glad. Okay. So, yes, and we're going to take questions from the audience at the end. And the first questions will be from the panelists to each other if we have any questions. And then we'll take them from everybody else. Thank you. Our next presenter will be K.Steiner.
I would like to yield 5 minutes of my time to my colleague from Los Angeles because I am giving a presentation tomorrow afternoon, and I hope you'll attend. I'll be talking about my very dear friend. It'll be a more personal presentation about my buddy Julian Priester. And so I'll just talk briefly. I started really seriously looking into Duke Ellington's work in the 90s when I read Mark Tucker's The Ellington Reader, and also Mark Tucker's early Ellington book. And in my mind, those are 2 of the greatest works about Duke Ellington ever written. And I was especially impressed with Mark Tucker's discovery of Duke Ellington's itinerary in New England in 1926 and 1927, where he went through old newspapers on microfilm, the old-fashioned way, and just started picking papers, and there was no Google search back then, and he uncovered where the Ellington Band was in the summer of 26 and 27. And I thought, wow, that sounds like so much fun. I wish I could have done that, but Mark already did that. And as my interest in Ellington increased, I attended the 1999 Ellington Conference in Washington, D.C., which was at one time my hometown. I attended college there and lived there. And at the conference, we went to the Smithsonian. I met Ken Vale, got his book. I later got a copy of Klaus Stradiman's book. I met the Italians who wrote the New Dessor. And by 1999, I said, oh, everything's already been discovered. We already know everything about Duke Ellington, when somebody joined the band, when this tune was recorded. And then I talked to Stephen, and he goes, no, 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 no. He says, the field of Ellington research is wide open, and it's still wide open. But my personal contribution, I believe, was before the days of newspapers going online, I was fortunate to have a great interlibrary loan department in Seattle, and they enjoyed finding me newspapers. So if I knew that Duke, for example, was in San Francisco in February of '34, I would think, well, maybe he played Sacramento. So I'd get the Sacramento newspapers. And has anybody here done research on microfilm before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I did develop a special touch. I could hit the fast forward button on the Tuesday paper, take my hand off the fast forward button, and I would land on the movie advertisements for the Wednesday paper. So that was a skill that's no longer in use, like most of my skills. But through a microfilm, I found, because Stratoman made great use of 5 African-American newspapers: the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the New York Amsterdam News, the Chicago Eagle, and the California Eagle, which was through Stephen, and the Baltimore African-American. There are African-American newspapers in at least 20 other cities that I have uncovered. The Gary American, the Boston Guardian, the Northwest Enterprise in Seattle, the St. Louis Argus, the Kansas City Call. The Kansas City Call is not online anywhere. The microfilm is hard to read. If you're doing research on jazz in the 30s, get the Kansas City Call, David. So it was through the black papers that we really got some context as to what the Ellington Orchestra was going through, because the white newspapers in the United States barely talked about Duke Ellington at all. They would have advertisements, the articles would be planted by Mill's publicity team. They might say, Ed and Selma Plout went to the dance in Carbondale last Saturday to hear Duke Ellington, but they didn't really say anything. Maybe the movie reviews. But through that, we were able to put together the itinerary. So I've checked all the dates that Stratoman had up to 1941, checked about 95% of his references, found many corrections. I don't want to say errors. I don't believe there's an error in that kind of research. And I don't even like the word corrections. It's more of an update or addition. And I'm going to give, so as we're passing the baton here, Stephen inspired me. I did a lot of research. I'm going to give all my research to David. And my hope is that our research will help other researchers, especially musicians like Michael, in doing their research. I'm not a musician myself, so I hope to help you. So I'll just say one last thing and then turn things over to David. Stephen, I don't know if this expression translates, is my brother from another mother. And I love him, and he's so generous. And if you're doing any research on Duke Ellington, talk to Stephen. So, merci beaucoup.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Smithsonian Institution's collection of manuscripts and what I've done there. And I'm starting off with a couple of photos by our good friend David here. You'll notice I've managed to find the same shirt 7 years later. I haven't worn it every day since then. But I think to start the journey, I really have to talk about someone else first. Missed the button, sorry. There we go. Annie Keebler. Annie Keebler. Who here met Annie Keebler back in the day? Only a few of us. Because Annie was formerly a bartender, and she suffered a significant house fire in the mid-1980s, and she sought a change of career, and she started volunteering at the Smithsonian. And I believe John Hassey was, I think his title was curator of the music division at the time, which may have been his title for many years, I'm not sure. But as a volunteer with no experience as an archivist, in the late 1980s, she was actually hired to work on the Ellington collection, and she became quite an expert and a key member of the team at the time. And it's mainly because of I think the Duke Ellington email list that I discovered some of the strange characters I'm looking at today, and heard about the collection of manuscripts. Now, my interest in Ellington started perhaps when I was about 15. I happened to pick up one of my father's records. He used to play jazz when he was younger, and I believe it was the Jazz Party in Stereo album, 1959, 7, you know the one, with all the percussion. And from there I happened to go into town in Sheffield and pick up a random Duke Ellington collection. It was the Capitol recording sessions on LP. So I started off by looking at the more obscure Ellington by pure chance, and that's often been the focus of my research. But really I want to pay tribute to Annie, because it was through her some of my interest in identifying a lot of the untitled Ellington came about. So it just happened that I got in touch through Facebook with her daughter just the other day. So someone could kindly make sure they have a photograph of this slide with me in front of it. I'll just send her a message later to say hello. Her daughter, who was thrilled to hear that I'll be mentioning her today as the inspiration for all of this, and we all miss her very much. So, let me just say, I know some people have said, I've always heard that there were no manuscripts, or very few manuscripts in the collection. And there are several myths that have perpetuated about this, such as things that James Lincoln Collier wrote in his book, such as all that Duke left was one trunk full of bits and pieces that defied order, or that an Ellington arrangement was just goose eggs on the page, sort of bare notes, just as a vague reminder for the musicians as to what to do. And various musicians who passed through the band on record as saying that when I arrived there was no music for ages. Well, most of these things are either complete, not a tosh, to use a word which I hope people understand.
Yes.
I'm going to be more polite. Utter tosh is the correct word. Or rather out of context. And it's true that sometimes they encountered no music because a departing sideman removed their pad, perhaps in an act of spite when they left. And so they knew the incoming replacement had no music. And I'm afraid that most of what James Lincoln Collier wrote is from most unreliable sources. And in fact, the Smithsonian Institution Archive Centre has over 100,000 pages of music. I'm not sure if that's half of the total, because I know that John said there are over 200,000 pages in total of documents. But it does actually contain the majority of the recorded works by Duke's orchestra and much more that wasn't recorded, scores by both Duke and Billy Strayhorn, sets of parts, or multiple sets of parts, recopied out years later, some complete, some not, and a few, tantalisingly few, surviving from the late 1920s. And they're all catalogued, not all in detail, and sometimes incorrectly, and I could expand on that later if we have time, if you want to ask, because it obviously was a mammoth task at the time. But the interesting thing was that you can actually, these days, and people have realised how obtainable and accessible the collection is, because you can make a request by email and they actually send electronic scans, which is very good from another point of view, because they slowly, bit by bit, as documents are requested, amass an electronic copy of the whole collection. So, what do I actually do? Well, for many years I transcribed Ellington. I started off by transcribing from LPs. One of my first pieces was probably Isfahan from the Far East Suite. And I have an old LP which is completely worn and crackly on Isfahan, because I was constantly lifting the needle back and listening to notes and writing down what I was hearing. But I started off back in 1996, or thereabouts, when I started contacting M.Kilpatrick, just out of sheer enjoyment to find out how he wrote. And it was only 10 years later, in 2006, I started my band, Harmony in Harlem. And as I mentioned earlier, I tend to keep off the beaten track, so my repertoire is a satin doll-free zone, if you see what I mean. It took me 8 years to take the A training on the pad. But maybe because Annie originally, in the early days, sent me just a couple of copies of a random selection of untitled or unknown works, that I became interested in this problem. And having a large pile of then photocopies and photographs from my early visits around 1998, 2000, and 2004, and I have since then amassed quite a large collection of these scans of almost all the untitled manuscripts. And so, as one of the 4 mad obsessives, I've spent a long time going through them over and over again in the hope of identifying them. And every now and again, you recognise something that you've stared at for 2 decades. And there's something, yes, I do recognise that tune. It's sort of buried in this little bit of arrangement. It's just a fragment. But now I recognise it. And so, bit by bit, I've uncovered, often by luck, some titled or mistitled manuscripts, including Bula, which I can talk about more at this time, and all sorts of other things, some of which actually I think derives from Ken and Stephen's work, because they at some point provided a list of pieces that we knew Duke had performed but not recorded in the early 30s. And so, having known what those titles were, I listened to recordings of other people on YouTube, so I was familiar with the tunes, and then, by chance, I matched those up with some other untitled documents. So there are several tunes from the early 1930s, and here's an example of what I've done, because my current task, which started about a year ago, is to actually provide a properly formatted feedback to the Smithsonian of everything I've identified, which amounts to a couple of hundred individual pages of score or parts. And I have a script on my computer which auto-generates a PDF with a letterbox fragment of the image, of the scan, and some important details, and whether it's identifying an untitled piece or identifying the title of something which had a shorthand title. And so now, there are 200 pages of these, and they've been inserted into the folders in the Smithsonian as a guide to any documents in that folder which are untitled or mistitled. And it just so happens we have 3 early 1930s manuscripts for You Brought Me a New Kind of Love, My Bluebird Was Caught in the Rain, which we know Duke performed but were not recorded. And so the task goes on, and there are always more things, and there's always another surprise when you suddenly spot something that jumps out at you on the page. But of course the main thing has been Bula, and that was mainly by accident. And for those of you who watched the presentation at the Swedish online conference last year, I went into great detail about that. But it was really just by speculatively requesting some manuscripts from the Smithsonian, because I wasn't familiar with the title, and then seeing a bit of music which related to another piece of music, or realising that the title actually fitted in to the Bula story, such as dock, which on its own means nothing, until you realise that it actually means dock as in the quayside of the port, where they loaded the slaves onto the ship, because at the end of that manuscript in Duke's hand it says, to slave ship. And it all ballooned from there. So actually I've been very lucky in finding all of these things, but that doesn't make me any less of a mad obsessive. Thank you very much.